Good morning, everyone. I can see people are just coming into the room now, but as we're waiting for people to come in, I'll just say it's great to have you all back for the second day, and for this our final conference keynote. And what I'm delighted about is that I'm introducing Simon, which is an honor for me. So Simon, as most of you will know, he's the professor of higher education at the university and director of the Centre for Global Higher Education, which we affectionately now call CGHE, as well as being joint editor-in-chief of higher education. So Simon's early work tracked the rise of entrepreneurial Australian universities in a neoliberal policy environment. And since 2000, he's adroitly tracked and critiqued and commented on the global higher education tiger, from the first Shanghai Jiaotong rankings to the global science system, from Australia to Black Lives Matter. Now, we all know the dangers of irresponsible metrics, so here are a few more. Of his 300+ peer-reviewed publications, including 25 books or so, more than a third have global higher education in the title. And before 2010, if you Googled on Google Scholar, you'd find that nearly 15% of the articles were his alone. It's hard to maintain that market share as the field explodes, but I think many of us here today will appreciate how much he's influenced our thinking and collaborated with a whole range of scholars, nurtured many careers, and currently within CG supported a whole new generation of postdocs and students. Simon's writing is marked by theoretical pluralism and scholarly common sense, as Clark Kerr once put it. This empirical pragmatism generates an epistemology grounded in the possible, the plausible, and the realistic. And I know today that we're a really innovative and open account. Simon's going to give us a little bit of autobiography as well. I know, Simon, you're going to surprise and provoke us. You're attending to globalization's possibilities and risks, good, bad, and ugly. Simon, the screen's yours.
Well, thank you, David. And hello to everyone. It's good to speak with you today in this format. And let me just at the very beginning acknowledge my thanks and my debt to Fazil Rizvi, who started me in global higher education when I went to Monash University in 1998. And that was a crucial turning point for me, opening up a whole world. And Fazil was the best of guides into that world. I was raised at the northeastern edge of Melbourne in Australia, where unpaved roads met fields and cows and bushland, and there were few local amenities. It was a developing suburb. My home was rich in culture and politics and not a lot of money. But there was annual mobility. We had an old car and a summer vacation once a year. And I remember from the earliest times, the spare and isolated Australian beaches and the limitless, ever-moving ocean where life began. My encounters with global difference at that time were in reading, which was profoundly important in shaping for me, and at the local school with migrant and refugee families from the Netherlands, Central Europe, and the Baltic states. My parents were strong Australian nationalists, a sensibility that always made me feel a little guilty because I didn't share it. I absorbed the anti-colonial outlook. We wanted to break decisively with Britain. But science fiction and history books had captured me and insulated me from any kind of nation-bound patriotism. Fortunately, my parents were also humanists, and they were not perfect, but it was the generation after the horror of the Holocaust. There was never a word of prejudice, no othering for any kind of person, whether by religion, culture, skin, voice, gender, sexuality, or ableness. And we were anti-war amid the Cold War and the imminent nuclear threat. Before I was 12, I'd formed my own view about the need to transcend arbitrary national interests and move to some kind of global federal government, a perspective that has stayed with me. So building a Centre for Global Higher Education half a century later in London and Oxford, places I never expected to inhabit, was consistent with those beginnings in the refusal of patriotism and the openness of the imagination. In books and the long summer walks on the sand by the inrushing sea, where there were always questions to ponder and time to think about them, and the vast open spaces of my country of birth matched the boundless landscape of reading. In intellectual exploration, there are no final answers. It's a continuing journey in which we only have our wits and each other. And the waters are always moving. There is always something new. Everything is always becoming. We cannot step twice in the same river, said Heraclitus of Ephesus 2,500 years ago. Everything is in flux, everything flows. And hasn't the global landscape of higher education been in flux since CGHE began its work at the end of 2015, which now seems like a lifetime ago, and changed in ways that none of us could have foreseen, all directly playing out in higher education and research. Brexit and the fateful turning away of the UK government from Europe, which will not end well. Trump and populism and white supremacy nativism and Black Lives Matter and the surge of decolonial activity across the world and in universities. The geopolitical fracture between the United States and China, in which the US has moved from a strategy of itself as a kind of developer, which will culturally assimilate and absorb the other, despite China's long history and boundless tradition, moving from that to a strategy of separation, containment, and hostility. And then there's the pandemic. The online world, more autarkic, but also more global. And our discovery in some countries of the limits of state competence and the limits of social discipline, our capacity to manage ourselves with concern for each other. And we have also felt the shared fear and danger. The family and friends have become closer, and compassion and helping. A global experience, the same, but also different everywhere, like the global climate change to come. Who could have expected any of this new localism and globalism? Now, in the remainder of this talk, I will reflect on the global and globalization, by which I mean the tendency to global convergence and integration in higher education and research. In abstract, globalization has wonderful potential. It offers the possibility we can work our way out of the national container, blocking collaborative action, for example, on climate change. Global convergence suggests a full and formative encounter with a diversity of human ideas, knowledge, imagination, government, institutions, social habits, on the basis of unity in diversity, here Bhutan, in Tianxia, all under heaven, the Chinese terms. No one country or culture has all the answers, and we have much to learn from each other. That's the ideal. That is globalization in abstract. In practice, global integration has not worked out so well. It's been a mixed blessing at best, hence the keynote title, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Now, in social science, we need descriptive categories for mapping space and time. When globalization is defined simply as integration and convergence, it carries no baggage. But globalization in practice has baggage. It's permeated by relations of power and politics. It's a zone in which different agents, including ourselves, try to work in our own interests. The birth of the internet in 1990 changed everything. It provided the technological conditions for a new kind of sociability, the first kind of world community. In higher education, post-1990 has seen phenomenal growth of faculty and student mobility, cross-border programs in institutions, partnerships and consortia between institutions, the sharing of information, the spreading of good practices. It has seen the birth, rapid expansion and worldwide diversification of the networked global science system with a growing pool of common knowledge, almost 3 million published papers each year. The number of countries with their own science system has doubled, and a quarter of all science papers involve cross-country teams, compared to 2% in 1970. The global science system is sustained by bottom-up collegial cooperation between scientists and social scientists operating outside their nation states and generating global common goods that are crucial to us, as the pandemic has shown. Higher education and knowledge are amongst the most globalized of all human activities. Well, that's the good part of the keynote title. We embody that good part of globalization when we meet together, like today in a world community of researchers. But that's not the sum of the global in higher education. Countries and universities do not have equal respect. Only some knowledge is really valued. The world-class university template in rankings embodies the cultures, values, lives, and economic interests of not of everyone, but of tiny national elites in a handful of countries. Brain drain decimates emerging systems. The globalization that emerged after 1990 in economy, culture, education, and science was not a shared space based on respect for the other and mutual learning. It was a hegemonic globalization grounded exclusively in the European, that is the Hellenic Judeo-Christian heritage. In economic terms, it was Western and primarily American. In cultural terms, it was Anglo-American. I'll call it Euro-American globalization because of its heritage, though it has also suppressed non-Anglo-American Europe to a degree. It fostered global openness to capital and the closure of relations of power, culture, and equality. Now, there are at least 3 different critiques of the ways that Euro-American globalization has fostered global hierarchy and inequality, the topic of this conference. Each critique contains important truths. The first critique focuses on Euro-American globalization in terms of neoliberalism. Post-1990 global communications coincided with the state-led strategies of corporate devolution and quasi-market reform that began in Anglo-America. The association was conjunctural, not causal. There was always more to globalization than world markets, of course, but neoliberalism colonized globalization successfully as an adjunct of global capitalism. Discourse of neoliberal globalization were blended with discourse about the marketization of higher education. We know that markets in education fasten onto hierarchies and foster unequal outcomes, make them worse. Competition rewards people, universities, and countries that have prior advantages. Capitalist globalization in its 1990s form of deregulated free trade has now hit the wall, blocked by nation states and abandoned by Anglo-American capital because it opened the door to China. But as a system of relations between government, markets, and people, and a relentless justification for inequality, neoliberalism retains its shaping power. The second critique of Anglo-European heritage globalization focuses on its enforced uniformity of culture and language, the primacy of Anglo-American culture and science, and the stigmatization and exclusion of everything different. World rankings favor large comprehensive research universities like Harvard. Vocational universities, teaching colleges, all other models are downgraded or eliminated. Consider network science. Global science is defined by the 2 main bibliometric collections, Scopus from Elsevier and the Web of Science from Clarivate Analytics. With the cooperation of leading scientists, Scopus and Web of Science are structured by an inclusion-exclusion binary at two levels. First, in determining what counts as codified science, and second, in the ordering of value inside it. This shapes national policies and determines performance assessments, academic careers, and university rankings. But most of human knowledge is excluded. Though English is the first language of only about 5% of the world's population, 93% of Scopus and 95% of Web of Science is in English, the one global language. There are no standard translation protocols that bring non-English papers into this single global language. In humanities and qualitative social science, most of the journals, even in English, are excluded from these collections. The globally recognized social science reflects Anglo-European and mostly US theories, concepts, and topics. Most journal editors are from the US and UK, and the definitions, validations, and exclusions are legitimated and reproduced by the Anglo-American universities that dominate global rankings as they produce the knowledge they validate. All endogenous, that is indigenous, knowledge is excluded. The closure is sustained by that deep English speaker certainty that our culture is not only the best, but it's sufficient. And no other insight is needed because it's necessarily backward or inferior. Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls it a radical denial of co-presence, continuing the colonial mindset. Sharon Stein says that systemic forms of domination are not just national and epistemic, but also ontological. That is, they sanction particular modes of existence and foreclose others. Global knowledge is the hope of the world, but the world is mostly excluded from it. The third critique of Euro-American globalization is in terms of white supremacy. Now, this begins, of course, in an older globalization, the colonial empires and their brutal gifts of occupation, genocide, cultural erasure, and economic slavery. It was taken seamlessly into the neo-colonial development era after World War II and into post-1990s globalization as neocolonialism. In a paper on whiteness as futurity and globalization of higher education published last month, Riyad Shah Jahan and Kirsten Edwards show that white supremacy and its cultural baggage are integral, central to the dominant forms of society, life, and higher education. And globalization has made this manifest in higher education on the world scale, centering power on Anglo-America, which is the whitest of the white. Whiteness, they say, as a state of knowing and being, privileges white people, institutions, and cultural norms, and orients social and political environments towards the benefits and protections of white life. Anglo-American whiteness as the ideal life shapes educational aspirations and migration patterns. Shah Jahan and Edwards argue that not only do white students gain racialized advantages, investment in international higher education by non-white students can be understood as an attempt to secure a white future. Status hierarchies in higher education make it economically and culturally harmful not to invest in the highest obtainable level of whiteness. White credentials travel easiest around the world, though with more certainty when the graduate is actually white. The global rankings template is a white institutional model that fosters desires for whiteness and calibrates its institutional provision. The whiteness argument helps to explain the overwhelming potency of both the US and the UK in international higher education, even though many other countries have developed strong domestic systems, and the US is not as economically dominant as it was. Mainstream analysis defines inequality only as social stratification and sidesteps coloniality and race. But we cannot understand the dark side of the global without placing white supremacy at the center. Universal whiteness creates inequality by elevating white people above others and by systems and structures that enforce a racialized hierarchy. Race is as powerful in entrenching inequality, domination, and control in education and knowledge as are economic wealth and social class, or language and culture. The categories, of course, overlap. Shah Jahan and Edwards state, within the context of European colonization, whiteness and capitalism cannot be disentangled. However, these engines of inequality are not identical. Each explains something that the others do not. In the critique of neoliberalism, Euro-American globalization is exploitative capitalism, unequal political economy. In the critique of cultural hegemony, it silences voices and excludes most of human knowledge. In the critique of white supremacy, Euro-American globalization stratifies people directly while forcing them to invest in a system which assigns them unequal value because exclusion would be even worse. Now that's the Euro-American globalization in higher education. And the critiques, I think, are true and compelling. So is that all there is to it? Do we then all accept that gross inequality is inevitable? Is it a dog-eat-dog world and focused on being the best, the strongest, the most evil dog? Or should we restyle ourselves as Taylor Swift or George Clooney? Of course not. I mean, no system of power is complete. The world is changing. The future is open. We have agency. The world is becoming more multipolar in political economy and more slowly in higher education. China has the largest purchasing power parity economy. India, Brazil, and Indonesia are all rising rapidly. And China-India trade will be the largest single highway of trade in 15 years or so. The north-south polarity is being modified by state building and rising incomes in parts of the global periphery. Not all parts, but significant parts are rising. There is a new east-south polarity between East Asia and Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia. China is now the largest annual producer of science papers in Scopus. India is third. Korea, Brazil, Iran, Russia, Indonesia, Malaysia are expanding rapidly. Indonesia is the fastest growing science system of all. Of the 25 fastest growing systems, half are in countries with average incomes below the world level, below the world average. Some are low income countries like India and Pakistan. Science is pluralizing. The US remains the mecca of science, the source of much of our most important shared knowledge, as well as cultural closure. And it's much the strongest system in medicine and life sciences. But in physical sciences, engineering, and especially mathematics and computing, the top universities in Singapore and China are at the US level. In high citation papers, Tsinghua in Beijing has passed MIT to become world #1. It's still Anglo-European science in content, but its production has become much more dispersed and diversified. And this provides more favorable conditions for global cultural plurality in future. The future will not reproduce the past. It will not reproduce the same Euro-American domination and high market ideology of the last 30 years. They are weakening. We do not know what the future will be. The conceit of social scientists is that we can know the future, that we can tell you what's going to happen, that we can make everyone safe with a kind of controlled futurity. But we do not know the future, and we cannot make everyone safe this way. The ordered patterns we find in social science are time and place bound. They do not universalize. And beyond them, social reality is open, not just in extraordinary times like now, like the geopolitics and the pandemic of now, but in any time. Heraclitus again. Whoever cannot seek the unforeseen sees nothing. The known way is an impasse. Our task as intellectuals is to look beyond the surface to what is unseen, because social relations cannot be wholly observed empirically and must be theorized as well. And because reality is not just the actual, but the possible. The future is conditioned by the past, but it does not necessarily replicate the past. It is disrupted by the unexpected, by contingency, and by human agency, by what we choose to do. And this is no bad thing, this uncertainty. The unforeseen opens possibilities for change and more space for agency. In social theory, we talk about structure and agency as if structure, for example, neoliberal power, the closed science system, the whiteness hierarchy, is fixed, and only agency is the source of freedom. And to a point, that's true. Structure is fixed. It's very difficult to change class or capitalism or the military or the fossil fuel and plastics industries or embedded racism. We can readily change only ourselves. We can self-cultivate in the Confucian sense. We can change our understanding, our capabilities, and our social relations. Michel Foucault said in his great last 3 years of lectures, the self is the one object we can freely will without having to take into consideration external determination. We can change ourselves whatever the structures are. And yet, and here's the larger hope, what we call social structure, what we normally experience as iron-bound external determination, does not stay fixed in place. Heraclitus was right. When the big unexpected changes happen, power structures are disrupted and new social potentials come onto the agenda. A doorway in time opens in which it's possible to make gains, though the doorway does not stay open forever. Now, this is what has happened with decoloniality and Black Lives Matter. The rise of an independent China, Korea, India, Iran, and others has disrupted 200 years of Anglo-American imperial hegemony and white supremacy. The universalist claims of the dominant culture have fractured. Like the Wizard of Oz in the 1939 film, when the dog Toto pulls back the curtain, reveals the wizard as just this small, mean man who is manipulating a machine to fool everyone. Hegemonic Euro-American culture is revealed as something smaller and meaner and specific to particular places, claiming more than it should, claiming a greater certainty and universality than it actually possesses. It's no accident that in the wake of the big geopolitical shifts, Black Lives Matter exploded everywhere into life. Similarly, in the 1960s, Martin Luther King knew that Vietnam's resistance to the US had opened a larger space for the civil rights movement in the United States. The global shows itself in distant events being causally connected, opening new possibilities in different places across the world. There will be larger changes in global higher education and research in future. Which changes they will be, whose changes they will be, rests partly on us. It's challenging, but I can see 3 strategic conditions that could advance a more equal higher education world, the topic of this conference. These elements already enter CG's research and in the global webinar program. First, I think we can be more vigorous than we have been in advancing sufficient institutional autonomy and absolute critical intellectual freedom as basic practices and values. In cases like Hungary's expulsion of the brilliant Central European University, or the Australian government's arbitrary and selective intervention in university partnerships in China. Partial institutional autonomy and absolute intellectual freedom are essential to all that we will be able to do, including the advance of equality. The quid pro quo, I believe, is that higher education and research must work on topics and tasks that are important to many people, even while we push the envelope. Second, we can work for an open definition of valid global knowledge, not to abolish or weaken science, but to dethrone the existing monocultural science, supplementing and accompanying it with the knowledge that's been previously ignored or marginalized. Not a question of creating diversity from above, but of acknowledging what is already there. Santos proposes an ecology of knowledges. Tristan McGowan mentioned this yesterday morning, with sustained and dynamic interconnections between differing knowledges, without compromising their autonomy, and also with intercultural translation. Now, this means renouncing any general epistemology. As Raymond Connell says, we don't want another system of intellectual dominance. Now, this does not mean that anything goes or that all truths are equal. It means the machinery of structural exclusion is discarded. It requires a change of heart in both science itself and in the bibliometric system. Third, we can more fully acknowledge our own capacity for self-formation. All of us are embedded in many different associations, in multiple lives and meanings. We must give ourselves and each other the room to change and grow. This means to be skeptical about the politics of singular and essential identity, and to refrain from sticking limiting labels on others. As I said in the conference opening, mutual respect and an open mindset is the way forward. I hope that higher education already does that for everyone who is here. It has done so for me. I thank you for being here, and it has been a deep honor to share my thoughts with you. Thank you very much.
Simon, thank you very, very much. I only wish we could all applaud in person and show our appreciations, but I know everyone, by the signs of the questions coming in, is already thinking hard. You've provoked us. You've really opened up. You've shared something of your own biography, which is so key to understand intellectual work. And I feel as if you have given us both a sort of provocative set of reflections, but also a manifesto. And I think that's particularly valuable here as we think about remaking higher education. What does this all mean for our future? So we've got some questions coming in. I'm going to ask the first one, but I really will welcome some more questions as you think about what Simon said and the implications of his reflections on race, on whiteness, on neoliberalism, and on how we might remake higher education. So my question, Simon, is really, what does all this mean for us as researchers? You gave us a vision for how there can be, another world is possible, but how might we change our methods to enact and create that world? Does this have implications for the data we use, for the methods we pursue?
I think there are many answers, David, and we all do somewhat different things. This is one of the nice things about working in social science, is that the plurality is right down to the level of the individual. People have got different theories, different methods, different ways of collecting data, analysing it, and reflecting on it. And so there's a myriad of answers to the question. But one of the things which I think is very helpful is to start to use more than one cultural template when doing conceptual, theoretical, and analytical and observation-based work. I've been fortunate to work with Lily Yang while she's been a doctoral student with us at UCL and at Oxford in the Centre for Global Higher Education program on the public good role of higher education. And Lily's doctoral thesis, which is complete and which is, we hope, is coming into book form soon, is a comparison of the traditional and modern Chinese way of thinking about higher education with the Anglo-American way of thinking about higher education. And she's identified different strengths and weaknesses in each. But the most important thing is that she's her work was then a basis for us to do some joint work, which we where we looked at each system from through the lens of the other. And it, when you think about American, British higher education, European higher education, from the point of view of China, you know, where the state is comprehensive, where the individual is nested in social relations in a more explicit way, where there's a tradition of self-cultivation and continuous improvement and so on. You look at the West in that, through that light, and you see it somewhat differently. You know, you might praise different things and criticize different things to what you would from within the West. And then of course you can do what we've always done, which is look at China in terms of Western ideas as well. And you compare those two different ways of seeing, and then suddenly you start to treat the cultures with equal respect. And then, you know, you then have a very interesting and difficult task of trying to work out what they have in common, where you can build something generic, and where diversity is helpful and useful, and what that diversity is. And so you start to build this relational picture, not single culture picture, but plural cultural picture. Now you can extend that method, I think, to looking at the variety of European traditions, to sub-Saharan African, Latin American sensibilities, South Asian sensibilities, and so on. And so it's painstaking. It took years for us to get the two big players into the equation and to look at them together. It took about 2 years of successive drafts, but you know, it does open up a new way of seeing when you do this, and I think that it's something which I'd really recommend for many others.
Brilliant, thank you, Simon, and that's a great pointer for things to read and work with. So as you can see in the chat, people are applauding, very moved by this presentation. You've got several brilliants, so people are really engaging and taking up these ideas. I'm going to ask Paul to come in if he may.
I assume you mean me, David.
I do indeed. Sorry, Paul.
Thanks, Simon. That was great and really interesting. And in a way, I think you've started to answer this. But clearly, there's this tension of all knowledge is limited, all knowledge excludes some and includes others. But it's the way in which we make achievements. You know, we have many things based on those particular knowledges. And as you recognise, you know, this kind of non-perspective position is just not a possibility. But, you know, do you have a sense of what strategies we can use to develop a more inclusive conversation that builds on a variety of perspectives, but also recognizes the achievements of particular perspectives? You know, and particularly thinking, you know, you gave an example there of yours and Lily's work, but, you know, these are collective bodies of knowledge. How do we do this collectively? You know, because that kind of almost speaks to an individual achievement or a small group of researchers achievement. Yeah. But how do we develop something more collective that actually contributes to bodies of knowledge that move us forward? Thank you.
Yes, and it's formidable because it involves us embracing, you know, more than one set of things, and that's hard work. And but I suspect that what we most need to develop is a sort of a new method of reflexive epistemology, where we think about bodies of knowledge in terms of what they can open up for us and also what they close. So we start to, I suppose, explain and discuss bodies of knowledge that way. And out of that, I think especially we can build on what we've already achieved, what we already know, when we seek to know more. But it's hard work and detailed work, painstaking work. So I mean, I think that it involves strategically identifying which conversations we need to bring forward early, and the decolonial colonial conversation at the moment is clearly one of those conversations, because there's many different ways we can go in building plurality in the engagement between bodies of knowledge. I think that what you've done for us in CG is you've centrally placed in the problem the power of knowledge and its crucial role in higher education. That is the essential feature of higher education, arguably, the fact that it's the engagement with knowledge and production of knowledge and all those things. And I think that if you like, that move, that centering on knowledge rather than, say, human capital value, enables us then to start to talk about the formative effects of knowledge and the way different knowledges include and exclude different things. The Santos work is very good because he seems to be able to work across numbers of different bodies of knowledge in a very engaged way and talk about the relations between them. I do think that's the way we need to go.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul and Simon. Adi Alavi, could you come in, please?
Thank you so much for that brilliant and eye-opening presentation. I find it very absorbing. My question is, in terms of political globalization, I want to know if education has become a very strong tool for cultural and economic imperialism.
I think the analysis of imperialism is still quite relevant. But you know, we're in the phase of neo-imperialism, when imperial power, I mean, what I talk about as Anglo-American power, I think is a neo-imperialism. It's the sort of power which is not exercised most of the time by direct military intervention. It's exercised through economic and cultural domination. And what's interesting is the way in which the cultural institutions are very resilient and longer lasting than anything else. So even if a rising nation becomes economically more capable, more self-sufficient and self-enriching, it's still within the framework of these institutional and cultural values which are reproducing the old Anglo-American or Western forms. And that's why the university is such an important institution. You know, it has this potential to both reproduce the neo-imperial domination, but also to provide points where agency can be built locally and nationally, and something different can be done. And I suppose I should just, as a caveat, because there is a kind of comeback to what I've just said, that the Anglo-American, or particularly American, neo-imperial period has not been without military intervention. Let's not forget that the Middle East is a zone of fire from, you know, Sudan to Afghanistan because of military intervention, successively over a period of time, really since the First World War, if you go right back. And you know, and the military threat has been very much part of the whole environment in East Asia as well. So, you know, neo-imperial power is still being exercised through military means as the last resort. And I think that, of course, is utterly unacceptable and something which we should all constantly push back on. We should value nations which don't use military mechanisms to relate to each other.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, both of you. Can I ask Philip to come in, please?
Hi there. Thank you for your presentation. Civilization is a very loaded term, particularly if we acknowledge the legacies of colonization, which is something that we have to do. Is there any usefulness in working with notions of a world civilization in higher education? Could the notion of a world civilization constitute not only a vision or emerging reality, but also a conceptual framework beyond and above any geographical borders or the politics of the nation state? Furthermore, could such a framework be used to perceive and evaluate world events, including empirical claims?
I think we start to do that already. And we do that individually from different places. And it's always a little bit shaped and articulated by our own cultural standpoints. If we make those explicit, that becomes easier to, I think, to work and to manage. But I think the question that you've raised is a really good one. And it raises the point about commonality and what do we have in common? What's the basis whereby we can all relate to each other and build something, because it's as important to build something universal and common that's good for us as it is to emphasize diversity, difference, and bring that forward. Unity and diversity has two sides. I mean, it has unity as well as diversity. So I always say to myself, what is it that we have in common? What can we work on that's meaningful? It isn't too culturally loaded or exclusive. The human rights canon then, raises all those questions. I mean, some of the human rights canon is specific to particular cultures. Other things may be more useful and more universal. I mean, we might want to work on academic freedom as a basic value for students and for faculty across the world, except even so, practices of academic freedom are culturally quite nuanced. And that's an interesting discussion, but I think there's something there that no one wants governments or corporations to tell them what to do. No one wants that. So there's something there that's in common that we can work with. Another thing that we might want to think about is the ethics of how we relate to each other, how we respect difference, how we bring difference in, how we build on what we discuss together and learn from it to take it forward, how we do something more collective, which is more than just individual contributions, as Paul said. So I think this is the kind of thing we need to meet on and talk on. What is it that we can establish that's common, that's useful for us, that provides a framework for us to work together beyond the neo-imperial period, beyond colonization, beyond the centered periphery world, to a world of unity and diversity? I mean, how will that be constituted? What are the necessary conditions under which we can conduct ourselves in that world? I think they're the really important questions now. If we don't do this, you can be quite sure that the nation state system and the corporate environment and the plastics and fossil fuel companies are not going to do it for us. We have to do this in higher education. We have to take world unity forward. We have to take the appreciation of diversity forward.
Great, big themes and big challenges. I'm really aware that we only have a couple of minutes left, and this needs all day, if not a month of discussions. Simon and I will both be in the breakout room where we can continue this more informally. But I'm going to ask two last questioners to come and just raise their questions, even if we don't get a chance to really explore them. So if I could ask Doria and also finally Alan, please.
Hi, Prof. Simon. Thank you so much for your presentation. Really inspiring. So allow me to indulge in two-part question. Question one, Prof, based on your presentation, are you suggesting that there is an update to your previous model of global, national, and local to global, national, local, and individual? Since at the end of the day, it's the individual that is going to shape the responses and what's going to happen after this. And the second question is more of your personal opinion. We've seen there's an emergence of future studies, a branch that attempts to envision what kind of changes that is going to happen in the future and our responses to it. Prof, given that, your presentation, should we be evangelists for future studies in order for us to be ready for any kind of issues and challenges that might emerge? Thanks, Prof.
And Alan, please.
Thank you, David. Just unmuting just there right now. Simon, terrific presentation. Truly, as I said, thought-provoking and sort of, I think it'll definitely be a change driver once we all sort of leave and go back to work. My question is very, very simple, and thank you, David, for allowing me this chance to ask it. It's about, what are there shades of whiteness or different types of whiteness? Because I'm here in Moscow in Russia, and I'm Irish, and I know that there are very different colors of whiteness. We're not all white the same. And that's basically, like, is there kind of that elitism or snobbery? Because when we say Europe is very, very big. It's East and West. So how can we address that in your point of view, Simon? How can we kind of make everybody like colorless or colorblind? Thank you.
You get 20 seconds to respond, Simon.
Gloria, I think really good to see you in this session. Yeah, I put the individual in. It was Gary Rhodes, actually, who said the global needs to be thought about in terms of agency. He was right about that. And in the end, you say, well, there's also individual agency, but I've also, in global higher education, which I teach with Shinshu at Oxford, developed a variation on the global model, which has the individual in it as well. But we've also divided the local into institutional and knowledge communities of the kind Paul was referring to, relational groups of people who are working, in an interdisciplinary or quasi-disciplinary framework as the normal, conduct of say faculty work or doctoral work. Future studies, well, I mean, you heard what I said about we don't know the future. I'm not going to do the Sex Pistols thing of no future, but there's a future to talk about. But I think future studies as such is probably not the heading I'd use. I'd use world studies or something like that, and then start to talk about the things I've been talking about the future. Alan, great to see you from Missis. I really enjoyed my interviews in Missis in 2013, and good institution, good people. Shades of whiteness. Look, I mean, I think that whiteness is an idea, a powerful idea, and the point about it is that it's historically rooted. So it's based in institutions, and it's based in societies, and it's based in classes, and so on. So there's a kind of ultra whiteness, whiter than the white core, if you like, whether the actual people are white or not. They're exercising that sort of ultra whiteness role in the world. And then there's, if you like, different levels. I think the point that Shah Jahan Edwards make is that whiteness is an impelling cultural form that we all feel obliged to somehow acquire or use, whether we're white or non-white. And I think that's an idea is powerful. But what happens in the whiteness as homogeneity and hegemony era is that people who come from countries which are identified as white countries can find all kinds of options in moving around the world and locating themselves in other places successfully. Non-white people, of course, in this era, don't have quite the same freedom and opportunity. But I think we all have to make our lives as we can, but in doing so, think about everyone else at the same time.
Okay, and with that, we are 2 minutes over. I thank you everyone for participating. I can hear the applause rippling from around the world. Simon, thank you for a great keynote. Please come and join us in the breakout room if you'd like to carry on this conversation. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and see you all again at a webinar of CGHE very soon.
Thanks, David.